From the outside, it looks like any other small Gothic church in the Czech countryside. Stone walls. A simple tower. A cemetery surrounding it. The kind of building you'd drive past without a second look. But if you walk through the front door, if you go down the stairs, if you descend into the lower chapel, and let your eyes adjust to the dim light, what you see will not leave you. Every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the pillars, the altar, is covered in human bones. Not painted to look like bones. Not carved to resemble bones. Real bones. The bones of real people. Arranged with extraordinary precision and extraordinary artistry into something that is simultaneously the most beautiful and the most disturbing thing most visitors have ever seen. This is the Sedlec Ossuary. The Bone Church. And the story of how it came to exist, the 700 years of history that turned a small cemetery in Bohemia into a chapel decorated with the remains of up to 70,000 human beings, is one of the strangest, most layered, most genuinely fascinating stories I have ever come across. Let's get into it. Hi guys, welcome back. Okay, so before I take you into the church itself, before we talk about the chandelier made from every bone in the human body, before we talk about the coat of arms assembled from skulls and hip bones, and a raven made of finger bones pecking at the eye socket of a human skull, I need to tell you how this place came to be. Because the decoration is extraordinary. But the history behind it is the part that I keep thinking about. And it starts, as so many things in medieval Europe start, with a handful of dirt. So, 1278, the Kingdom of Bohemia. Bohemia, which is today the western part of the Czech Republic, was in the 13th century a significant European power. It had silver. Specifically, the region around a town called Kutna Hora, about 70 kilometers east of modern Prague, was sitting on top of one of the richest silver deposits in all of Central Europe. Kutna Hora was, at its peak, the second most important city in the Kingdom of Bohemia after Prague itself. It was wealthy, connected, and significant. And just outside Kutna Hora, in a suburb called Sedlec, there was a Cistercian monastery. The oldest Cistercian monastery in Bohemia, founded in 1142. It had a cemetery. A normal cemetery. The kind of place where monks and local people were buried when they died. In 1278, King Ottokar II of Bohemia sent the abbot of the Sedlec monastery, a man named Henry, on a diplomatic mission to the Holy Land in Jerusalem. Henry went. He completed his mission. And when he came back, he brought something with him. A small quantity of soil. Specifically, soil from Golgotha, the hill outside Jerusalem where, according to Christian tradition, Jesus Christ was crucified. The most sacred ground in the Christian world. Henry scattered this soil across the Sedlec cemetery. And word got out. Now guys, I need you to understand what this meant in the context of medieval Christian belief. Because it wasn't just a symbolic gesture. In the theology of the time, in the deep, genuine, all-encompassing faith of 13th century Central Europe, being buried in soil that had touched the place where Christ died was believed to offer a tangible advantage in the afterlife. A faster path to resurrection. A more direct connection to the sacred. People across Bohemia, Moravia, Poland, and beyond heard what Abbot Henry had done. And they wanted to be buried in that soil. The Sedlec cemetery became, almost overnight, the most desirable burial site in Central Europe. Wealthy families sent their dead to Sedlec from hundreds of kilometers away. Dying pilgrims made the journey specifically to ensure their final resting place would be in this ground. The cemetery expanded. And expanded. And kept expanding. And then the catastrophes came. Because here is the thing about the 14th century in Bohemia, guys. It was not a gentle time. In 1318, just 40 years after Abbot Henry scattered that holy soil, a famine struck Kutna Hora. A serious, devastating famine. Historians estimate that up to 20,000 people in the Kutna Hora region died. All of them, or nearly all of them, were buried in the Sedlec cemetery. Because this was still the holy ground. This was still the most sacred place to be laid to rest. The cemetery absorbed 20,000 bodies in a short period of time, and somehow kept going. 30 years later, the Black Death arrived. The bubonic plague swept through Bohemia in the mid-14th century, with the same efficiency it showed everywhere it went. In the Kutna Hora region alone, approximately 30,000 more people died. And they were buried in Sedlec. The cemetery that had already been strained by the famine burials was now receiving tens of thousands more. Graves were stacked. Bodies were placed on top of older remains. The cemetery grew to 3.5 hectares, a vast field of the dead radiating outward from the monastery walls. And then, in the early 15th century, the Hussite wars swept through Bohemia. A religiously and politically motivated conflict between Catholic traditionalists and reformers that devastated the region. Another approximately 10,000 people were killed in the fighting around Kutna Hora. They too were buried in Sedlec. So by the early 15th century, the small monastery cemetery, where Abbot Henry had scattered a handful of holy soil, was holding somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 human beings. In a field of 3.5 hectares. There was no more room. Not even close. Around 1400, a Gothic church was built in the center of the cemetery, the Cemetery Church of All Saints. It had an upper chapel for regular worship and, crucially, a lower chapel. An underground space. Designed specifically as an ossuary, a place to store the bones of the dead, who were exhumed from the overcrowded graves above to make room for new burials. The bones of plague victims, famine victims, war casualties, and ordinary Bohemian people, who had simply wanted to be buried in holy ground, were brought down from the cemetery above and stored in the lower chapel. Tens of thousands of sets of human remains. In a vaulted underground room. Just sitting there. And then, around 1511, someone had to do something with them. The task fell to a monk. A half-blind Cistercian monk, according to legend, the sources don't record his name. He descended into the lower chapel, and began to arrange the bones. He sorted them. He stacked them. He organized the skulls and femurs and tibias and ribs into 6 large pyramid-shaped mounds that filled the corners and spaces of the chapel. The legend says something else, guys. It says that when the monk finished his work, when he had organized the remains of tens of thousands of people into something orderly, something that gave shape to what had been chaos, his sight returned. I don't know what to do with that detail except to tell you that it exists. That someone, at some point, believed it was true, or wanted it to be true, or found something meaningful in the idea that giving order to the dead could restore what had been taken from the living. The bones sat in their pyramids. 4 centuries. The monastery continued. People were born and died and the world moved on. And then, in 1783, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II abolished the Sedlec monastery, as part of a broader program of religious reform. The property passed through various hands and eventually came into the possession of the Schwarzenberg family, one of the most powerful aristocratic dynasties in Central Europe. They became the new patrons of the Cemetery Church of All Saints. And the Schwarzenbergs, being the kind of family that the Schwarzenbergs were, decided that something should be done with the bones. In the mid-1860s, somewhere around 1867, a woodcarver descended the stairs of the lower chapel at Sedlec. His name was František Rint. He was from a small town called Sedlec Ossuary, about 150 kilometers to the northeast. He was a carpenter and a woodcarver by trade. He was not a sculptor of international renown. He was not a famous artist. He was a craftsman, a very good craftsman, who had been hired by the Schwarzenberg family to do a job. The job was, put the bones in order. That was the commission. Put them in order. What Rint did instead was something that nobody asked for and nobody, I would argue, could have fully anticipated. He started by disinfecting the bones, bleaching them with chlorinated lime to give them a uniform pale white appearance, making them clean, making them workable, making them into material. And then he got to work. He took the 6 pyramids that the half-blind monk had built 350 years earlier and rebuilt them into 4 enormous bell-shaped mounds, one in each corner of the chapel. They are still there. They are larger than most people expect, some of them reaching toward the vaulted ceiling above. Then he started on the decorations. He strung garlands of skulls across the entire length of the vaulted ceiling, skull after skull threaded together, and draped in long looping chains, the way you might drape lights across a room. Except the lights were skulls. He built monstrances, the ornate sunburst-shaped vessels used in Catholic worship to display the Eucharist, out of pelvic bones and vertebrae. He built chalices from bones. He constructed candelabras and lamp holders from stacked bones and skulls. And then he built the chandelier. The chandelier hangs from the center of the nave. It is enormous, roughly 8 feet across, and it is made entirely from human bones. Every single bone. That is the fact that makes people stop and stare, guys. The chandelier is said to contain at least one of every bone in the human body. Every single bone that you have inside you right now, every bone you were born with, every bone you grew into, every small and large and oddly shaped bone from your fingertips to your skull, is represented at least once in that chandelier. Rint assembled them with extraordinary precision. The larger bones forming the structural framework. The smaller bones, vertebrae, small hand and foot bones, the tiny bones of the inner ear, incorporated into the details. Skulls incorporated as the points from which candles extend outward. The whole thing hanging on a chain from the ceiling of an underground chapel in a small suburb of Kutna, Hora, in the Czech Republic. It has been hanging there since 1870. But the piece I find the most remarkable, the piece I think tells you the most about František Rint as a person and about the strange commission he received and what he made of it, is the Schwarzenberg coat of arms. On the wall of the lower chapel, Rint assembled the full heraldic coat of arms of the House of Schwarzenberg. In complete detail. Every element of the official family insignia reproduced in human bone. The corded shield. The crown on top, its band made from sacral bones, its body shaped from pelvic bones with skulls set at the centers, the cross at its apex constructed from long bones, the whole thing outlined in the rounded ball joints of femur heads and fringed at the bottom with rib bones. And in the lower right quarter of the shield, the detail that stops every visitor, who looks closely enough to see it, a raven. Made from small bones and wire. And beneath the raven, a human skull, fitted with a bone ponytail representing the Turkish hairstyle of the 16th century. The raven is pecking at the eye socket of the skull. This image commemorates a specific historical event, the conquest of the Ottoman-held fortress of Rab, in what is now Hungary, by Adolf von Schwarzenberg in 1598. The Schwarzenberg family was so proud of this military victory that they incorporated it into their official coat of arms. And Rint reproduced it, in complete and accurate detail, in human bone. A bone raven. Pecking the eye from a bone Turk. Hanging in a chapel full of the bones of 40,000 to 70,000 plague victims, famine victims, and ordinary medieval people who wanted to be buried in holy ground. When Rint was finished, he did one final thing. He spelled out his name on the wall near the entrance to the chapel. In bones. F. Rint. 1870, his hometown, Česká. He signed his work in the medium of his work, which is either the most audacious artist's signature in history, or the most matter-of-fact one, depending on how you look at it. Now guys, I want to zoom out for a moment. Because the Sedlec Ossuary exists in a broader tradition of ossuaries across Europe, the Paris Catacombs, the Chapel of Bones in Hora in Portugal, the Brno Ossuary in the Czech Republic, and all of them share the same underlying theology. The concept is called Memento Mori. Remember that you must die. The bones are not there to frighten you. Or, they are, in a specific way, but fright is not the point. The point is to confront you. To make the fact of your own death unavoidable and present. To strip away the comfortable distance we all maintain between ourselves and the reality of our mortality. The official statement from the Church of All Saints, the church that administers the ossuary today, is clear about this. It is not a celebration of death, they say, but it symbolizes the equality of people before the throne of God. And there is something in that, guys. Something that I find genuinely moving alongside the genuine horror of it. Because when you look at those bone pyramids in the corners of the chapel, when you understand that inside them are plague victims and famine victims, and war casualties, people who were rich and people who were poor, people who were powerful and people who had nothing, they are completely indistinguishable. The bones of a wealthy merchant who paid handsomely to be buried in holy ground and the bones of a peasant who died in a ditch during a famine are arranged in the same pyramid, contributing equally to the same chandelier. You cannot tell which is which. You never will be able to. There is something the Sedlec Ossuary says about human equality that no living room full of people and their visible differences in wealth and status and power could ever say as clearly. In the end, the bones are just bones. The Sedlec Ossuary is part of the Kutna Hora UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 1995. It draws over 200,000 visitors a year, making it the second most visited destination in the Czech Republic after Prague. Since 2014 it has been undergoing significant restoration work. In 2016 the famous chandelier was carefully dismantled, bone by bone, cleaned individually, and reassembled. When the restoration began, workers discovered over 1,000 additional skeletal remains that had been hidden behind walls and under floors during previous renovations, people who had been there, undocumented, undisturbed, for centuries. Since 2020, photography inside the ossuary has been prohibited. Not because of any spiritual objection, but because of the behavior of some visitors, people treating the space as a backdrop for casual photographs, failing to observe the basic respect that 40,000 to 70,000 dead human beings deserve from the living. That detail, I think, says something too. The story of the Sedlec Ossuary starts with a handful of dirt from a hill in Jerusalem. With a medieval belief that being buried in the right ground could change what happens to you after death. With the accumulated dead of a famine, and a plague and a war that together put tens of thousands of people into the earth of a 3.5-hectare cemetery that couldn't hold them all. It passes through a half-blind monk who sorted their bones into pyramids and, legend says, had his sight restored for the effort. It arrives at a woodcarver, who was told to put the bones in order, and instead turned them into one of the most extraordinary interior spaces in human history. Who signed his name in the medium of his commission. Who included a bone raven pecking a bone eye from a bone skull in the coat of arms of the family that paid him. And it continues today, in a small suburb of Kutna Hora, where the bones of up to 70,000 people sit in their carefully arranged positions, and approximately 200,000 living people per year descend the stairs to look at them. I don't think it's a horrifying place, guys. Or rather, it is, but that's not all it is. There's something in it that I find unexpectedly honest. The bones don't pretend. They don't offer comfort or distance, or the usual reassurances that we surround death with. They just sit there, arranged with extraordinary care, and they say the same thing the half-blind monk and František Rint and 700 years of medieval theology said. This is what we are. All of us. Eventually. And you can't tell the rich one from the poor one. So perhaps that matters less than we think while we are here. Okay guys, that is the story of the Sedlec Ossuary, the bone church of Kutna Hora. 700 years from a handful of holy soil to a chandelier made from every bone in the human body. What do you think about it? Does it feel to you like a place of horror, or a place of something else? Would you visit it? And what do you make of the idea of using the remains of real people, plague victims, famine victims, people who died in wars they didn't choose, as the raw material for decoration, even beautiful decoration, even decoration with genuine spiritual meaning? I genuinely want to know where you land on this one. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this video was worth your time, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. Subscribe if you haven't already, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, guys. Bye.